Welcome, listeners, to the Crime Tales from Travels podcast, the show where we highlight crimes and similar stories from places that we have been, traveled to and from, places that we have spent a fair amount of time, or sometimes even just places that we have just passed through. And the latter is what we have for you today. We're going to be discussing a Halloween murder that happened as of Halloween 2024. It's happened 18 years ago, so for 18 years this has remained unsolved. Stick around to learn more. So thanks for choosing to join us today. I am your host, Kimberly Rotet. And before we dive in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that I think and choose to trust that within the podcast community, and I only just entered this space, but I do believe that so many of us are retelling these stories with reverence and respect for the victims as well as their families, obviously, at least to the extent that we're able to do so. And today isn't any different, but I wanted to acknowledge that something struck me as I was writing this episode. As I was doing research for the script, I couldn't help but notice that our victim's mother was in some of the more recent publicity of the story. And honestly, for the first time since starting this podcast endeavor, I found myself wondering, should I contact the family? Get their take, get their comments on record? But then I thought, would they even want to participate? They have stayed active in the news regarding their daughter and family member, but would they even be interested? Honestly, just a lot of questions kind of filled my head, and then I quickly silenced that thought. This podcast, this space, I trust that what we're trying to build here is something that will pay attention to details and show that deserved reverence. But it's an endeavor that I have just started, and the content and the podcast itself is only starting to circulate. It's still just so new. My reach might be growing, but right now it still feels so very new. So I didn't reach out. Let me say this, though. I am truly grateful for the folks listening. Doing so will certainly help the podcast grow and circulate in various ways. Please, continue to do that. Share the content if you appreciate it. That being said, please don't also forget to subscribe, Apple or Spotify. Leave a good review if you like the content. And don't be afraid to engage with us on social media. Follow us on Instagram by searching Crime Tales from Travels. You can also check out additional content on YouTube if you search Cairo Productions Network. You search that on YouTube, Crime Tales from Travels, because this show is a part of the Cairo Productions Network. As always, the show notes for this episode and others will be on the website, cairoproductions.net. Today we're going to be covering the unsolved murder of 16-year-old Terressa Vanegas from Dickinson, Texas. She was born on August 9th, 1990, and she was the youngest of 5 children. When she died, she was a freshman at Dickinson High School, and she was one who worked hard to keep her grades up. And her life was taken, and her family and friends and loved ones were left with very few answers to a whole lot of questions. But as we customarily do, let's recap the premise of the podcast. So we're not just necessarily choosing cases we want to cover. We are not choosing the most outlandish cases that we find, or sometimes even just those super popular cases. We might get a few of those here and there, but that's certainly not our intent. We're covering cases from places that we have traveled to and from, places that we have spent a fair amount of time, or places that we've just passed through, right? When I lived in Houston, I drove through or just passed through Dickinson, Texas every single time we drove to Galveston or Kemah. So Dickinson, Texas is a place that I'm familiar with, and as it turns out, this murder took place not long after I moved from the greater Houston area. And as of recording, it's spooky season. And I know a lot of people look forward to Halloween. The day itself can easily mean that kids are going to dress up. People gather. It's typically, what I would think of as a social day. I can recall my youth and Halloween, and I don't remember too many nights from when we were much younger trick-or-treating. I know we did, but I feel like we chose to spend more time at home passing out candy than going out trick-or-treating. In college, I know we had multiple years where we did scary movie nights, but you get the idea. It's typically a night where people, gather in some capacity. But it's also a painful anniversary for the Vanegas family. Gosh, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But each year on Halloween, and now for 18 years, the day marks the anniversary of the tragic and unsolved murder of their daughter, Terressa Vanegas. And she was 16 years old when she died. Now, for geographical context, Dickinson, Texas is located about 20 miles northwest of Galveston, Texas on I-45. It also sits about 35 minutes southeast of downtown Houston. And at the time of Teressa's murder, Dickinson had a population of about 18,000, give or take. But with each year that passes, it leaves a family still having more questions than answers. And it keeps law enforcement still searching for more information. But let's review the events of the Halloween in 2006. According to Eyewitness News 13, Teressa never made it home from school that day. But as we learn from some supplemental source material, she had kind of already had plans to hang out with some friends and potentially even stay over at someone else's house, even though it was a school night. At the time, Dickinson, Texas Police Sergeant Tim Cromie, he was the lead original investigator at the time that she was murdered, but they said that they were able to track her movements kind of well into the evening on that October 31st, 2006. It's reported that Teressa was last seen kind of leaving or around the Green Cay subdivision at about 11 p.m. at night. But after 11 p.m., to our public knowledge at least, I guess there could be a little bit more information. Maybe we should expect that there be a little bit more information that is potentially being withheld in case there's a potential suspect. But at least to our potential, public knowledge, this was the last time that her whereabouts could be confirmed. Unfortunately, the next time she was located was when she was found on November 3rd in a field near Dickinson High School when a dirt biker spotted her in the field. But what happened to Teressa from the time she got out of school until 11 p.m.? And some of that still seems a little bit of a mystery, at least from what I could find. But if I'm being honest here, this is where I want to be really careful. I found a couple, like 1 to 2 podcasts with a few more notes, but I also couldn't locate the exact source material that some of these podcasts used. I couldn't locate it myself. That's not necessarily to say that it didn't exist. They might have reached out to family. Remember, I didn't. I just wasn't quite comfortable doing that in this case. So I couldn't find some of the source material to corroborate it myself, and I'm going to try to make note of that as we get through the story. But what I can feel comfortable saying, or at least speculating, remember, it's Halloween, and we know many kids, teens, adults are going to socialize on this day. They're going to gather with their friends. They're going to do something maybe a little bit out of the ordinary. But I also want to be cognizant to distinguish between what was published in ways that I feel like I could have fact-checked rather than just only relying on social media or certain things I might find on the internet. I know, blame higher education and my doctoral degree holding training, but I struggle with things that either aren't peer-reviewed or that I feel like I can't fact-check and kind of just find the absolute truth when it comes to what was reported. But meaning I couldn't find enough of what I was hoping to find in a forum that I could fact check, and therefore I am going to have to acknowledge that I'm doing also a little bit of speculation, but I'll try to make note of that. Because again, I didn't reach out to the family, but all that being said, I don't know exactly if she was hanging out with friends that night, because that wasn't necessarily something that I could find that the police said, but I know that it was discussed on some other forums, via the internet. So if she's hanging out with friends, that maybe she's bouncing around to a couple different friends' houses. And again, it's Halloween, so it would be really reasonable to think that that were the case. One of the podcasts that I found, and again, I only found a couple, but they had noted that the Dickinson police told reporters that Teressa had left and kind of left home before, maybe stayed away for a couple of days before. But I couldn't find that material myself, so that might have been a personal interaction that particular podcast might have had. I'm speculating on that as well, but it seems really important to the story that if they'd had that conversation and maybe somehow they had found out that this wasn't the first time she maybe didn't come home or just made plans to stay at a friend's house, even on a school night, that maybe that wasn't out of the ordinary, so it wasn't something that was truly alarming just yet. But that same podcast, that same source material also noted that Teresa was anticipating staying at friends' houses that night. So maybe she'd had that conversation with some of her family. However, for one reason or another, that plan to stay with some friends, we know as a result of what was published via some reports, was that plan fell through. And it was apparently that led to the last known sighting of Teresa that was outside of that subdivision, walking in a general vicinity, in a general direction of home, but unfortunately she never made it there. With this information, though, we are left to assume Teresa's family could have anticipated that she was staying with friends that night, and because it wasn't until the next day on November 1st, when she did not come home from school, that her parents and family started to go look for her. When they learned, on that November 1st, that the plans that she had had the night before to stay with a friend fell through, obviously some concern, red flags went up, and they went to file a missing persons report. And as they're filing this missing persons report, a bolo, a be on the lookout, was issued when none of her friends were able to say, you know what, I haven't seen her since last night. Obviously, that kind of generated an increased level of concern. Another social site indicated that Teresa was going to meet a guy that night. And that site had mentioned that guy was 19 years old from Abilene, Texas, or somebody that she had met on one of these chats. Now, keep in mind, Facebook, Instagram, some of these things hadn't blown up just yet in terms of the popularity that some of these social sites might be today. So even in 2006, if we can remember that far back, like sometimes you were chatting with people on specific websites and engaging with other people that way, not necessarily on social media just yet. But what we can also speculate that law enforcement likely was able to kind of speak with the people that she was hanging out with that night, and they were able to a certain extent kind of track some of her movements through technology. And if they were able to track some of those movements with technology, her phone messages and things like that, or places where people reported seeing her, where they were able to get footage from that from that location, video footage, we can speculate that a lot of those things started to occur, and if there were persons of interest, that they were able to rule people out, or at least have discussions with those folks. But here's what we do know, is that to date, her disappearance and with her death, no one has been arrested to date. We know from material published in the media as well that the family shared with Teresa that Teresa was strangled, raped, and had her hair cut off. One of the pieces of source material noted that the dirt biker who found her noted that there was a belt around Teresa's neck when he saw her, when he found her. We also know from local reporting that Jeanette, Teresa's mother, had made a positive identification, noting that it looked like her daughter had been severely beaten. There were a lot of bruises and swelling that had occurred. While the autopsy itself was not fully released, we know from some of those autopsy notes that people engaged with conversation with reporters that the medical examiner did rule the death a homicide. We know from reporting that it was estimated that Teresa had been deceased for at least 2 days when she was found, and that really kind of puts it up to that time frame of when she was last seen. What we also know that's been reported from the media, that obviously there was a search for answers that was kind of ramped up, in the immediate aftermath of her finding her deceased. But then when her family went to go have her funeral, it also came up in conversation that just 2 days before Teresa disappeared and was murdered, a friend of hers named Kimberly Ramsey, had disappeared with her own boyfriend. And according to the Houston Chronicle, law enforcement initially, I think it was Texas EquiSearch, I think initially was concerned that the two situations might be related. But Ramsey was found a few days later along with her boyfriend, and kind of ruled out that particular thought. We also know this. Eyewitness News 13 reported that Dickinson police have followed up on many, many leads over the years. As best I can tell, though, I haven't been able to find an official statement about how Teresa died. Meaning, to me, that they're holding on an awful lot kind of close to the chest. One of the articles published by Eyewitness News did quote Dickinson police, though, as having questioned at least 45 people over the years and essentially following up on what was, quote, dozens of leads. So over the years, 18 years, they've been working on this case, and have at least questioned at least 45 people, in the disappearance and subsequent murder of Terressa. The other thing that we know, and is still, very impactful, we know that her family is still searching for answers. Teressa's mother, Jeanette, would like more answers from the Dickinson police. From one of the quotes that I read in, I think it was the Eyewitness News, one of the Eyewitness News articles, I feel like we can conclude that Jeanette might be frustrated, feeling as though perhaps not enough progress has been made. In one of those stories from Eyewitness 13, Jeanette was quoted as saying, quote, "I'm still very sad and hurt, but the main thing is we want closure. We want whoever did this to be where they need to be, behind bars, so he doesn't hurt someone else, another little girl," end quote. There were some additional hints of frustration from Jeanette and the family, again being quoted as saying, quote, "I just feel like I don't have any rights because I never get an update," end quote. I think statements like that, quotes like that, I think it's fair to assume that that Teressa's case is, potentially now considered a cold case, but then I think we have questions, right, as we might inevitably have, because we're not the police, we're not the law enforcement, we're not doing this every day, we're not involved in those discussions, so we inevitably have these questions. So does Teressa's case fall into a category that gets reviewed every few years when someone starts digging into cold case files? I find myself wondering, are there even still scheduled meetings, monthly, quarterly, or gosh, man, it even pains me to say this out loud, but annually, something where Teressa's family has provided an update. There may not be anything new to share because there's not a legitimate, lead or something to stand on, but could they at least learn, or do they at least learn, what actions have been taken by law enforcement, phone calls that might have been made, interviews that might have been conducted, honestly, even just additional research, or kind of just someone new with a fresh set of eyes reviewing the case. And maybe this is just, kind of dense for me to ask this question and wonder, because I've, fortunately for me, never had to have been in this space, but do things like that occur after this long a period of time, after 18 years? Something else that seems interesting, although admittedly I'm not sure if I can kind of find something that's fact-checked for documentation of this connection, but in the years after the death of Teressa, some, not all, but some of the lists that they list her name among the victims of those known to be associated victims with the Texas killing fields. The Texas killing fields is also known as the I-45 serial killings. I certainly don't know if there's a connection, but what we do know from reporting is that since the 1970s, there have been more than 30 bodies that have been discovered around this generalized area, this League City, Dickinson, Texas, in between Houston and Galveston area. It is possible, I suppose, that Teressa was a victim of these serial killings, but I certainly don't know, and I can't find anything that law enforcement has made that connection. But I know that when multiple bodies show up in a generalized area, it would certainly be really easy to ask that question. It seems like almost like your mind would automatically jump to that question. And if you're unfamiliar with the Texas killing fields, you can check out a documentary on Netflix called Crime Scene, the Texas killing fields. You can check that out. But it's really important to note that with all of these 30 plus bodies that have been found in this general area, there are multiple suspects connected to multiple names of that body count list. So it really seems like there's just this area, maybe a little bit of a remote stretch of space, not as built up as what it, as maybe some other, neighboring locations, but a space where bodies can be dumped easily. That seems to be the case because there are multiple suspects connected to multiple murders of bodies that were found in this location called the Texas killing fields. And the other thing that we know, this is a difficult case to cover. I can't even imagine what the family must be going through 18 years and just honestly seemingly nothing. But perhaps one of the most important pieces of this is to note that this is still obviously ongoing. People are still actively searching for tips or information. It's really hard, sometimes I sense this, to kind of follow what was actually said and reported versus maybe what's hearsay. And I don't mean that word in a bad way, just potentially some other things that maybe came up in discussion on social media or internet threads. And forgive me, but I think it might be just really hard for people to not talk when they're not being given details. But I also understand why law enforcement is holding on to specific pertinent details. They can't show their hand either. I think we, in our heart of hearts, we understand that. I get that. They need to have something to kind of nail the individual once they finally find them, and I do, I understand that. I simply cannot imagine what it's like for her family to not know 18 years later. If you or anyone happens to know something, anything, what do they say? No detail is too small or insignificant. And at this time, I would hope that authorities are taking whatever piece of information they can get. But if you have any information about the murder of Terressa, please call the Dickinson Police Department. It's 281-337-4700. You can also call Galveston County Crime Stoppers at 281-763-8477. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you're new here, thank you for joining us. An even bigger heartfelt thank you to those of you who might be returning. If you have questions about the source materials, please visit the website, kroproductions.net. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review if you enjoyed today's episode. You can also find us on Instagram by searching Crime Tales from Travels. Crime Tales from Travels is a part of the Kro Productions network. And until next time, stay safe, stay curious, but remember that the truth is often stranger, potentially even more disturbing than fiction.